All right, good morning, boys and girls. Today is Monday, and I'm so excited because those of you that know me know that I have a dog, Rex, and he is coming home today. He was getting trained to not hunt, but retrieve waterfowl because my boys like to goose and duck hunt, and we get to go pick him up today. He's been gone for 6 weeks, and I haven't seen him for over 2 weeks, so I'm super excited. But today we're going to start our new book, and it is called Friendle. It's a super fun book. Boy's a little bit of a troublemaker, but I think you'll like it. It's written by Andrew Clements. So we'll read a couple chapters today. Here we go. Chapter 1 is called Nick. If you ask the kids and the teachers at Lincoln Elementary School to make 3 lists, all the really bad kids, all the really smart kids, and all the really good kids, Nick Allen would not be on any of them. Nick deserved a list of his own, and everyone knew it. Was Nick a troublemaker? Hard to say. One thing's for sure, Nick Allen had plenty of ideas, and he knew what to do with them. One time in 3rd grade, Nick decided to turn Miss Deaver's room into a tropical island. What kid in New Hampshire isn't ready for a little summer in February? So first he got everyone to make small palm trees out of green and brown construction paper and taped them onto the corners of each desk. Miss Deaver had only been a teacher for about 6 months, and she was delighted. That's so cute. The next day, all the girls wore paper flowers in their hair, and all the boys wore sunglasses and beach hats. Miss Deaver clapped her hands and said, "It's so colorful." The day after that, Nick turned the classroom thermostat up to 90 degrees with a little screwdriver he had brought from home. All the kids changed into shorts and t-shirts with no shoes, and when Miss Deaver left the room for a minute, Nick spread about 10 cups of fine white sand all over the classroom floor. Miss Deaver was surprised again at just how creative her students could be. But the sand got tracked out into the hallway, where Manny the custodian did not think it was creative at all, and he stomped right down to the office. The principal followed the trail of sand, and when she arrived, Miss Deaver was teaching the hula to some kids near the front of the room, and a tall, thin, shirtless boy with chestnut hair was spiking a Nerf volleyball over a net made from t-shirts tied together. The 3rd grade trip to the South Seas ended suddenly, but that didn't stop Nick from trying to liven things up. Lincoln Elementary needed a good jolt once in a while, and Nick was just the guy to deliver it. About a year later, Nick made the great blackbird discovery. One night, he learned on a TV show that the red-winged blackbirds give this high-pitched chirp when a hawk or some other danger comes near. Because of the way the sound travels, the hunter birds can't tell where the high-pitched chirp is coming from. The next day, during silent reading, Nick glanced at his teacher, and he noticed that Mrs. Avery's nose was curved, kind of like the beak of a hawk. So Nick let out a high, squeaky blackbird peep. Mrs. Avery jerked her head up from her book and looked around. She couldn't tell who did it, so she just said shh to the whole class. A minute later, Nick did it again, louder. Beep! This time there was a little giggling from the class, but Mrs. Avery pretended not to hear the sound. And about 15 seconds later, she slowly stood up and walked to the back of the classroom. Without taking his eyes off his book and without moving at all, Nick put his heart and soul into the highest and most annoying chirp of all. Peep! Mrs. Avery announced, "Janet Fisk, you stop that this instant." Janet, who was sitting 4 rows away from Nick, promptly turned white, then bright crimson. "But it wasn't me, honest." There was a catch in Janet's voice as if she might cry. Mrs. Avery knew that she had made a mistake, and she apologized to Janet. "But someone is asking for big trouble," said Mrs. Avery, looking more like a hawk every second. Nick kept reading, and he didn't make a peep. At lunchtime, Nick talked to Janet. He felt bad that Mrs. Avery had pounced on her. Janet lived in Nick's neighborhood, and sometimes they played together. She was good at baseball, and she was even better at soccer than most of the kids in the whole school, boys or girls. Nick said, "Hey, Janet, I'm sorry you got yelled at during reading. It was my fault. I was the one who made that sound." "You did?" said Janet. "But how come Mrs. Avery thought it was me?" So Nick told her about the blackbirds, and Janet thought it was pretty interesting. Then she tried making a peep or two, and Janet's chirps were even higher and squeakier than Nick's. She promised to keep everything a secret. For the rest of Nick's 4th grade year, at least once a week, Mrs. Avery heard a loud peep from somewhere in her classroom. Sometimes it was a high-pitched chirp, and sometimes it was a very high-pitched chirp. Mrs. Avery never figured out who was making that sound, and gradually she trained herself to ignore it, but she still looked like a hawk. To Nick, the whole thing was just one long and successful science experiment, and Janet Fisk enjoyed it too. All right, Chapter 2, Mrs. Granger. 5th grade was different. That was the year to get ready for middle school. 5th grade meant passing classes. It meant no morning recess. It meant real letter grades on your report card, but most of all, it meant Mrs. Granger. There were about 150 students in 5th grade, and there were 7 5th grade teachers, 2 math, 2 science, 2 social studies, but only 1 language arts teacher. In language arts, Mrs. Granger had a monopoly and a reputation. Mrs. Granger lived alone in a tidy little house in the older part of town. She drove an old, pale blue car to school every morning, rain or shine, snow or sleet, hail or wind. She had a perfect attendance record that stretched back farther than anyone could remember. Her hair was almost white, swept away from her face and up into something like a nest on the back of her head. Unlike some of the younger women teachers, she never wore pants to school. She had 2 skirt and jacket outfits, her gray uniform and her blue uniform, which she always wore over a white shirt with a little cameo pin at the neck. And Mrs. Granger was one of those people who never sweats. It had to be over 90 degrees before she even took off her jacket. She was small, as teachers go. There were even some 5th graders who were taller. But Mrs. Granger seemed like a giant. It was her eyes that did it. They were dark and gray, and if she turned them on full power, they could make you feel like a speck of dust. Her eyes could twinkle and laugh too, and kids said she could crack really funny jokes, but it wasn't jokes that made her famous. Everyone was sure that Mrs. Granger had X-ray vision. Don't even think about chewing a piece of gum within 50 feet of her. If you did, Mrs. Granger would see you and catch you and make you stick the gum onto a bright yellow index card. Then she would safety pin that card to the front of your shirt, and you would have to wear it for the rest of the school day. After that, you had to take it home and have your mom or dad sign the card and bring it back to Mrs. Granger the next day. And it didn't matter if you were in 5th grade, because the way she saw it, sooner or later you would be. All the kids at Lincoln Elementary School knew that at the end of the line, 5th grade, Mrs. Granger would be the one grading their spelling tests and their reading tests, and worst of all, their vocabulary tests, week after week, month after month. Every language arts teacher in the world enjoys making kids use dictionaries. Check your spelling, check the dictionary, check those syllable breaks. But Mrs. Granger didn't just enjoy the dictionary, she loved the dictionary, almost worshipped it. Her weekly vocabulary list was 35 words long, sometimes longer. And if that wasn't bad enough, there was a word of the day on the blackboard every morning. If you gave yourself a day off and didn't write one down and look it up and learn the definition, sooner or later, Mrs. Granger would find out. And then just for you, there would be 2 words of the day for a whole week. Mrs. Granger kept a full set of 30 dictionaries on a shelf in the back of the room. But her pride and joy was one of the huge dictionaries with every word in the universe in it, the kind of book it takes 2 kids to carry. It sat on its own little table at the front of her classroom, sort of like an altar at the front of a church. Every graduate of Lincoln Elementary School for the past 35 years could remember standing at the table listening to Mrs. Granger's battle cry, "Look it up! That's why we have the dictionary." Even before the school year started, when it was still summer before 5th grade for Nick and his friends, Mrs. Granger was already busy. Every parent of every new 5th grader got a letter from her. Nick's mom read it out loud during dinner one night in August. Every home is expected to have a good dictionary in it so that each student can do his or her homework properly. Good spelling and good grammar and good word skills are essential for every student. Clear thinking requires a command of the English language, and 5th grade is the ideal time for every girl and boy to acquire an expanded vocabulary. And then there was a list of the dictionaries that Mrs. Granger thought would be acceptable for home study. Mrs. Allen said, "It's so nice to have a teacher who takes work so seriously." Nick groaned and tried to enjoy the rest of his hamburger, but even watermelon for dessert didn't cheer him up much. Nick had no particular use for the dictionary. He liked words a lot, but he was good at using them. But he figured that he got all the words he needed just by reading, and he read all the time. When Nick ran into a word he didn't know, he asked his brother or his dad or whoever was near what it meant. And if they knew, they'd tell him, but not Mrs. Granger. He had heard all about her, and he had seen fifth graders in the library last year, noses stuck in their dictionaries, frantically trying to finish their vocabulary sheets before English. It was still a week before school, and Nick already felt like fifth grade was going to be a very long year. All right, boys and girls, have a good rest of the day. We'll tune in tomorrow for chapter 3 and 4 of Frindle. Have a great day.